Hello, I'm Dr. Sherry, author of the Cruise Through History Stories, and frequently seen you on cruise ships as a storyteller. And today I want to take you through the streets of one of my favorite cities, a city that comes out to you as soon as you pull up to the pier and your ship or your riverboat docks, and that's the city of Amsterdam. What I do in the Cruise Through History Stories is introduce you to your benefactors, to the characters who built the city and lived there, and left for you a landscape of beauty that you can enjoy as you walk through the streets. So we are going to walk through the streets of Amsterdam and its history in pictures. We're going to walk through 8 centuries along the canals in the home of Rembrandt and the characters who gave us tulips and chocolate, and of course, the home of Anne Frank. And I'll introduce you to some new names, Clusius, and the architect who designed all of those magnificent spires that you see as you step off onto the port and look out on the landscape. Let's look at where we're at. We're in Amsterdam, a unique landscape. It's on the shallows of the Zuiderzee, a shallow waterway that doesn't give us a deep water port through the city. And the fathers of the city made the most of where they are by building canals, eventually just a few, and then more and more until they gave you the city that we have today. So we're going to walk through the history of the city until we come back to our pier and where we are today. Let's start really in the 14th century with the church that we first see. The churches are the kerks. So we see Oudekerk, built in 1306. Actually, there were Germanic tribes that settled in the area along the Amstel River in about 1275, and their dogs ran along the river. And this city began as part of Holland, founded in 1300. And this that you're looking at, the Oudekerk, is one of the first churches consecrated in Rome. It was a wooden church in 1306, and the people of Little Amsterdam made beer, which they exported throughout their small world through the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League is really another story, a German mercantile association that acted under the noses of royals and built the first inter-port relationship that broke medieval society. And Amsterdam took part in that. It was a beneficiary of the Hanseatic League, and it sent its beer throughout their ports, up the North Sea and throughout the Baltic. There was a terrible fire, however, in the city in about 1452, and it was rebuilt of brick. So the landscape that we begin to see is late in the 14th century and into the 15th century of brick. And you're looking at the newer church, the newer kirk, and we go on from there. But before I go further, let me take you through the shopping center in the center of town, and a great example of the brick structures that were built after the fire. We come from the pier down the main street that comes right from the pier, takes us right into Dam Square. And we see the stunning example of Amsterdam Renaissance architecture, a unique style to our city. And look up at those spires. We'll keep coming back to spires, and then I'll introduce you to the architect that designed it and gave us Amsterdam. Well, let's look at Amsterdam in the early days. I'm showing you an old woodcut of the early city when the canals were just begun, and you can see the picture of all the little ships in the tiny harbor sending beer throughout the Baltic and into the North Sea. Unfortunately for Amsterdam, it was part of the domain of Philip II of Spain. King of Spain, very Catholic King of Spain, and he inherited all that you see on this map in purple, so that what was known as the Spanish Netherlands or the Spanish lowlands, it was Spain and Portugal, the southern part of Italy and Sicily, and it included the Netherlands, which were Calvinist, Protestant. And Philip had no tolerance for anything that wasn't a Catholic or a Catholic-run organization. And he was an onerous king. There were revolts and battles and bloodshed in the streets of Amsterdam. Finally, it resolved in a treaty in 1579, and the north of the Netherlands was able to remain Protestant. That included Amsterdam. And the southern part, which included Antwerp, was still under the domain of Philip and kept Catholic. All through its history, Amsterdam has benefited from religious toleration. And the Protestants of Antwerp came to Amsterdam. They brought their finances with them, and they enabled the city to grow. Poor Antwerp shriveled under Philip, and eventually, as if it was a Protestant wind blowing at Philip, the port of Antwerp shriveled and silted up, and the economy was never again as great as that of Amsterdam. So Amsterdam reached its golden age. And what I'm showing you here, you'll be able to see as soon as you come into port. And this is the historic building of the Dutch East India Company, which eventually added the Dutch West India Company. From these docks, ships went out for the mercantile ports of the world. The East Indies went to Jakarta, went all through the Spice Islands, and brought spices to Europe on Dutch ships, which added to the wealth of the people of Amsterdam, and Amsterdam grew. But a rather novel thing happened in Amsterdam. There were 8 companies that had ships going to the east to bring back spices, much to the delight of those purveyors of spices at the source, because with so many ships vying for their product, they raised prices until the Dutch found that their profit margins were being squeezed. And so the head of Holland, the Maurice, the stadholder or the governor of the Netherlands, decreed that there should only be one company, the Dutch East India Company. And he chartered what was known as the VOC, and I'm going to butcher the Dutch pronunciation of Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC. It was a monopoly from the Holland, and it was the first shareholder corporation with directors and stockholders. They could hire an army to protect their interests in ports throughout the world and to protect the goods that they harbored in the warehouses waiting for shipment. And most important, everyone in Amsterdam could invest. The working man could invest in stock. So in 1602, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange sold the shares to stockholders in what became the first mercantile, the first commercial export-import company in the world. Later, there were British companies and French companies, but the first was in Amsterdam. And over 200 years of the existence of the VOC, there was a 3,600% return on investment for stockholders. So the average man and woman of Amsterdam had expendable wealth to build the city and to buy art. They created 6.5 million guilders in capitalization, which was an absolute example of its time, far more wealth than seen even in London. At its height, the VOC had 1,500 ships and employed 1,000 people in Amsterdam, many of them building the 1,500 ships that took their goods all through the world and brought spices to Europe. The French bought spices through the VOC, and the profits stayed in Amsterdam. They carried mail, they carried passengers. It was a commercial adventure that was seamless in its operations, but not entirely blameless. Throughout its empire, its ships went to the Far East, where local directors created plantations. Owners worked conditions for those who were enslaved there. The people of Amsterdam knew that they invested in returns that were supporting their family even more than the head of household was earning in their daily jobs. But they didn't know the means that were being used. And they were horrified when there were slave revolts in Jakarta and the company began to unwind. And then there were wars with the British. Look, I'm showing you here the roots of the Dutch East India Company. And as it expanded across the Atlantic and there were islands in the Caribbean, they became the Dutch West India Company. Vast network for their 1,500 ships going throughout the world. The Dutch were the masters of the seas, and Amsterdam was the beneficiary of the profits, of the riches that were brought home. And the city was built on the 17th century golden age of Dutch commercial control of the seas. Well, as I told you, these ships went everywhere. And when the slave revolts occurred in Jakarta and there were massive massacres, the people of Amsterdam were uncertain of their investments, and many of them began to divest themselves. And then there were wars with the British. I'm showing you here a scene from a war in 1672, but actually there were 4 wars as they fought across the globe. And we know of one of those most famous. The Dutch had New Amsterdam from the exploration of Henry Hudson, a Brit who came in, well, it was English at the time, who came in the Half Moon in 1609. As a pirate, the Dutch had sent him to find a northeast passage, and he went instead westward toward the New World, found the Hudson River, and New York was founded as Dutch Amsterdam. In the battles with the British, later with the English in the 1700s, and of course Britain, when it became Britain in the 18th century, New Amsterdam became New York, and the end of the golden age for the Dutch began. It unraveled until in the Napoleonic Wars in 1795, the French controlled Amsterdam. They took a look at the books of the VOC. The VOC was no longer able to borrow funds from the government for commercial investment, and it was bankrupt. And private trade companies grew from there, but the great age of the VOC was over. In the 20th century, Amsterdam grew on private investment within the city, and it became the independent kingdom of the Netherlands. So let me go back now that we've taken the city through its development and history, and let's look at the city that was built. The canals were expanded. They began in 1544, expanded in the 1640s. They expanded again in the 1660s into the 1670s, and we begin to see that sort of half-moon shape of the city as it grew, and the canals were expanded to accommodate the growth of the city. And I'm showing you within the little green arrow some reclamation as the harbor was dredged to accommodate ships with more of a depth in their draft, and the city took the shape that it has today and about 1770. So the city was resplendent on the income that came through the VOC. By the time the VOC was bankrupt and Amsterdam moved more into its modern age of commerce, the city was established, the canals were dug, and the shape of the city is what we see today. And so many of the beautiful buildings were built during that golden age when all of the wealth of the world came through its harbors. So let's look at building this city. You're looking today at a 17th century city kept preserved for us to enjoy as we walk the same streets today that the merchants walked 300 years ago. And they built the levees along the dikes that held the canals. And the machinery of those dikes is still there, and we can see them in operation as we walk along the canals of Amsterdam today. Look down the canals and you'll see a rather intriguing building with all of the little pointed roof lines. This is the Waag on Market Square, where the great markets were held for the locals to come and purchase silks from China. Kimonos were worn. Japanese kimonos were all the rage in the 18th century. Eventually, this became a way station and an office for a surgeon's guild. Today, we enjoy it as a coffee shop and a museum. At one point, a Rembrandt hung in this building, but today we'll go to the museums to see the Rembrandt. Today, we'll stop on the Great Market Square and maybe have a coffee before we wander further along the canals of Amsterdam. The Zuiderzee, that shallow waterway that protected Amsterdam from the storms of the North Sea, dredged to allow deeper ships, and feeding the canals of Amsterdam, allowed it to grow into a prosperous, beautiful city where all of the major streets could transit along the canals to market, to church, and home. Now I want to introduce you to a character whose name may not be familiar to you, and this is Henry Keizer, the city architect during the Golden Age. If timing is everything, his time in Amsterdam occurred when the city was flush with funds to build, and he obliged with buildings in what became known as Amsterdam Renaissance style, the style of Keizer. If you like to wander the city taking pictures of the spires, Amsterdam has the most glorious spires, all begun by Keizer, some of which were completed by his son. So I'm showing you just a little compilation of some of those spires. And if you look at the little woodcut to your right, you can see that behind what you see at the street level is an interior courtyard of the business buildings occupied in its day by the merchants who brought the wealth to the city that built the streets along which you walk. And let's look at some of the churches that were endowed by that wealth. The Ziedekerk is along those streets, again with a tower built by Keizer. It was behind this church that Rembrandt had his first home when he came to Amsterdam. And we see the Westerkerk, a little newer, begun by Henrik Keizer and finished by his son, but with its iconic spire, definitely in the Amsterdam Renaissance style. This church, by the way, will be your signpost as you look for the Museum of Anne Frank, and we'll come to that in a bit. The Noorderkerk, a little smaller, a little more of a diminutive spire, but still anchoring the city in churches north, south, east, and west. And of course, there's the DEIC building itself. Now you're looking into the interior of the building, the interiors that you don't see from the street. And you can imagine 300 years ago, as the merchants looked at the various goods coming in from the ships and stored them in some of these rooms and held their meetings and made their trade deals. All today still part of the businesses that now occupy Amsterdam. Let's look at another building by Keizer, the Town Hall. It sits on a rather shallow area of foundation, and under it, it anchors in the Zuiderzee. There are 13,659 piles. I'm showing you how school children remember this because they all memorize the number of piles on which the town hall sits. And they do this by looking at 365 days in the year. They put a 1 in front and a 9 behind, and they get an A on their lessons every time. Back in Dam Square, where the road from your ship takes you into the center of the city. This is the city where people shopped by 1700. Such a well-developed and affluent city with the buildings with the little spires, again inspired by Keizer. And this is what it looked like bustling in the 1900s, sort of looking rather Victorian in addition to Dutch Amsterdam. And today, as we wander Dam Square, looking as it did 300 years ago, beautifully preserved by the Dutch, so that as we come through from our riverboat or our ocean vessel, we are in the city at its golden age, and we can walk the streets, look about, and put ourselves in that context. Well, now I want to switch to its most famous resident, Rembrandt. Rembrandt Harmenzoon von Rijn, the Harmenzoon meaning son of Harmen, and von Rijn because his family were millers on the side of the river, of the Rhine River. What you're looking at are two paintings of Rembrandt by Rembrandt. He had a habit of painting a self-portrait twice each year. So we have a record of those that remain of how he matured over time, how he aged as an artist over time. But he was recognized with artistic talent when he was only 14, and he was sent to a university to study art. His family knew that he would be an artist and not a miller, and he was apprenticed to a master artist until he was about 18. He came to Amsterdam in 1625 and came back to stay in 1631. Amsterdam is where he painted his greatest works, and it's where he lived to his death. He was attracted to this city for its vibrancy and color and its contrast in the darkness. And we see that contrast of light and dark in his paintings. He uses it for drama. The 17th century was a wonderful time to be a Dutch artist. Amsterdam was in its golden age. It had a large middle class with disposable income, and the Dutch enjoyed decorating their homes with Dutch art. The English were also great admirers of Dutch artists, and they too collected Rubens from Antwerp, and certainly they were interested in Rembrandt from very early time. This was a time when there were private commissions for art. Churches had public art, but they did not commission that art. Very interesting, very different than circumstances, say, in Italy. What you had in Amsterdam in the lifetime of Rembrandt, where it was a time of freedom, where artists felt free to paint scenes of daily life as they chose. So what we have is a history of life in Amsterdam of the time. They're not only art for the sake of great beauty, but they're also historic as they record the people and the events. And the second great part of Amsterdam, not only its commercial vibrancy and the light that enabled and inspired art, but artists painted as they chose. They didn't always work from commissions. The habit was, the basic way of operating was to paint as they chose and then sell completed works. It was a novel concept in the world of art, not replicated, say, in Italy and other places, but in Amsterdam, there was a certain air of freedom, of intellectual freedom, of expression. And Rembrandt has said that he painted not so much for honor as for liberty. He was born at the right time, in the right place, and he made the most of painting. What you're looking at is a painting on wood, the stoning of Saint Stephen. It gained Rembrandt instant recognition as a young artist and made him highly collectible, not only in the Dutch provinces, but also in England. And Rembrandt was able to afford his first residence in Amsterdam behind the Zuiderkerk, as I showed you. And as he looked around, he saw women on the streets selling pancakes, and they became the subject of his later etchings. In 1632, when Rembrandt was only 26, he painted a commission. Actually, this was one of his few commissions, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. And we'll come back to Dr. Tulp when we talk about tulips, because Tulp is not his real name. It is in Dutch tulip. He was so enamored with tulips that he changed his name. But this masterpiece was the first major commission enjoyed by Rembrandt and established his fame in the city. He was at that time living with another artist, and he met the cousin of that artist, Saskia, who became his wife and the mother of their 4 children. Unfortunately, only one of the 4 lived to adulthood, Titus. Look now at the painting, The Rape of Europa, in 1631. It's currently in the Elizabeth Stuart Gardner Museum in Boston. A painting from the essence of the Renaissance literature, but it was done by many artists, certainly by Rembrandt in his iteration. Look at the light and the dark and his use of red. Use of red as a focal point became a characteristic that we'll look for in all of Rembrandt's paintings as we go forward. But first, he had to pay the rent. And to pay the rent, he painted portraits. So many in Amsterdam had disposable income and loved to have their portraits painted. And for 300 guilders, Rembrandt would paint your portrait. So many of the homes of the wealthy, of the merchants of Amsterdam, had Rembrandt's portraits painted for them. Not his favorite way to spend his time, but it certainly was a steady income. And it enabled the Rembrandts to purchase this house, as they did in 1639 on number 4 Jodenbreedstraat Street. Jodenbreedstraat. Breedstraat is Broad Street, and the Jodenbreedstraat is just across the canal into the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. And as Rembrandt would walk through the streets, he would paint some of the local people. He would make sketches, and later those sketches were part of his etchings that are preserving again the history and the lifestyle of the city that gives us even more than art. It perpetuates what we know of this time and his life. And look at his house. It's so perfect for Rembrandt. The first floor was full of light in those abnormally large windows for the era and the type of architecture of the city. His house had so much light. And look at those red shutters. He could manipulate the shutters to cast shadows across his canvas so that he was naturally painting mostly in shades of brown into the shadows, and then he would highlight with red. On the second floor was his studio, and on the third floor was where the family lived. And up in the eaves there were students, because Rembrandt was now a master, and the students copied his work or filled in the edges or worked through the finishing touches under the direction of the master. Life for the Rembrandts was ideal, and he painted himself with Saskia. Unfortunately, 3 years later, Saskia died, probably of tuberculosis. And the happiness in the house went with her, but the painting continued. Rembrandt would spend his time going through auctions in the city. He would purchase armor and other what we would call antiquities, and he didn't mind paying high prices for all of these props that he would store throughout the house and use as stage sets when he set up his paintings. Look now at the painting we know as the Night Watch, and you'll see it in the Rijksmuseum in your walkthrough, your actual walkthrough when you're in the city. A huge painting, painted when he was only 36. And he received commissions. The painting was 1,600 guilders. Each participant, each of the subjects in the painting, paid 100 guilders. Some of the people were very happy with themselves in the painting. Others were unhappy because Rembrandt employed something novel, if not revolutionary, in his painting. Instead of painting soldiers side by side. He painted them in overlapping figures to create a scene. The name of this painting, the full name, is The Parade of the Civic Guard, led by Captain Franz Bonin Koch. And there's the captain right up front. And our eye is following the light right to the central figure. And then the drama is added by just a touch of red. When you're viewing this painting in the Rijksmuseum, see if you can find Rembrandt. He's there in the shadows. But here you're looking at Rembrandt at his height, the dark and the light, making use of what catches the eye and brings you into the drama. Rembrandt painted not so much to record his figures as to give us a dramatic moment. He painted not their faces, but the emotion expressed. That caused issues with further commissions. People wanted to be painted in the most beautiful self-impression and not for the emotion that Rembrandt saw. To us, it makes him a great painter because he was unique and brilliant in bringing out the person within. But at the time, people wanted pretty pictures to hang in their dining rooms, and so his commissions somewhat dwindled. He painted his son Titus as a monk in 1660, and again look at the shades of brown and the light just shining on the face of the contemplating monk with just the hint of red that draws us into the center of the painting. It's said of Rembrandt that he was the Shakespeare of painters. He would have liked that. And then he experimented with etching. Late in the 1640s, as he was painting, he would also go for walks along the canals, and he would sketch what he saw. And then he experimented with etching. Now, to etch, you take a copper plate coated with wax, and then use needles to remove the wax in areas. And then when the wax is finally removed, the plate is inked and the paper is drawn across the plate to create the etching, to create the print. What's brilliant about Rembrandt is not only his subject matter and his way of expressing what he saw, but he experimented with making finer and finer needles. His needlework is some of the best etching of its era, if not the best etching over time, because of his ability to create this fine, this definition, this depth in etching. The painting that you see here, the etching that you see here in the Met Museum in New York City, is Rembrandt's impression of his city as he walked along the canals in areas where the city was not quite developed. And he saw the old Jewish people in Judenbredenstraat, and he included those in his etchings. Now, it was unlawful in Amsterdam to be poor, to beg on the streets. They were the unseen, but not to Rembrandt. He immortalized them in his etchings that have been preserved today. There were about 2,000 Rembrandt etchings, 400 of which have been located and identified today. So there's a great library of not only Rembrandt's work, but the history of Amsterdam. Look at the Polish writer. This was meant to be a commission of a man who was neither Polish nor knew how to ride a horse. Today it's in the Frick collection. And this is the painting that created all the trouble for Rembrandt. In 1600, he was adjudicated bankrupt in Town Hall. And then a year later, the town fathers in that same town hall invited him to paint a huge painting, a masterpiece of painting, 16 feet by 16 feet, to occupy an entire wall. And the subject that he was directed to paint was Claudius Civilis, the icon of history and the mythology of his conquest that led to the founding of Amsterdam. Well, he was a one-eyed hero. And Rembrandt painted him not in his glory, but in his reality. And so what you're seeing is a painting with light, not so much red, and a painting of reality, of a story, of a dramatic moment in which there was a conspiracy against him. But the city fathers of Amsterdam were just livid. This is not what they wanted. They wanted to see the man in a glorious profile without the injured eye being exposed. And so the painting only hung for a short period and it was taken down and put away. One of the last of the major commissions that Rembrandt was to receive was the Syndics of the Cloth Drapers Guild. We know it more as the Dutch Masters. This is more the painting that his subjects wanted, where everyone paid for the painting and they were painted equally so that they could all take pride in their appearance. And this painting undeniably shows them in a power position, prestigious leaders of the community. And it enabled Rembrandt to receive just a few more commissions before he became ill and painted less and less. But he painted again his self-portrait. You're seeing here a self-portrait in 1658, still looking a bit regal, wearing some of his props, holding to the idea that he was a wealthy man of Amsterdam. And then look at him in 1660. And by 1669, he's showing his age. In 1669, Rembrandt died. And he was buried in a rented grave behind Westerkerk. And you're looking at his monument only, the coffin having been removed at some point from the simply rented grave. In 1877, Van Gogh visited Amsterdam and gave homage to Rembrandt. He visited his former home, and Van Gogh said of Rembrandt that there was something of the gospel in Rembrandt and something of Rembrandt in the gospel. And when you're in Amsterdam, you'll visit the Rijksmuseum, which gives an entire dramatic gallery to the paintings of Rembrandt. Full size, at the end of the corridor, you'll see the night watch, which, by the way, we know more appropriately as the day watch, because then once it was cleaned, it wasn't as dark. And you'll also visit the adjoining galleries of Van Gogh, as the city pays homage to both great painters. So now I'm going to switch gears on you and look at the universal symbols of love celebration. Tulips, chocolate, and diamonds, all of them glorified in Amsterdam. Let's start with tulips. The earliest species of tulips actually came from east of the Black Sea, and traders brought them to China. But in China, it was much too warm. Tulips don't proliferate well unless they have a nice frosty winter. And the Ottoman Turks rode west in the 13th century with their tulip bulbs. And when they arrived in Constantinople, they conquered this Byzantine Christian capital and made it their own. And Suleiman the Magnificent, you're seeing him here with his tulip turban. The first thing he did was plant his tulips. And if you're fortunate when you're in Istanbul, you'll be there at the time of a tulip festival. Suleiman enjoyed 1,500 varieties of tulips. By 1630, there were 80 flower shops offering tulips in Istanbul. Credit for introducing the tulip to Europe goes to a Portuguese sailor. And those tulip bulbs traveled, remained healthy, and still produced flowers even over the long voyages. Bulbs reached Netherlands by 1570. It was later when they reached England and France in 1598. Well, the first bulbs to reach the Netherlands came into the hands of Carolus Clusius, the greatest botanist of the 16th century. Once again, time and place was fortuitous. The bulbs came into the hands of Carolus Clusius, and he looked at them and wondered, should they be proliferated as a plant or as a food item? sauteed in a little white wine and eaten. Fortunately for all of us, Clusius decided that the best use of these bulbs was as flowers. Clusius is an interesting character. He was actually French. He was born as Charles l'Écluse in France in 1526, but he traveled to the Spanish lowlands looking for unique plants. And when Lutherans were forced to leave Catholic France, l'Écluse moved to Amsterdam and changed his name to Clusius and proliferated bulbs, the tulip bulbs in Amsterdam, which adds to the history and became the new iconic vista that we see. In 1592, Clusius was given a position at the University of Leiden to build its botany program. And he put his tulips throughout the gardens, and so often did plant thieves raid his garden for tulips that he threatened to give away all of his remaining bulbs. And when he died in 1609, he had not seen what he had done for Amsterdam and all of Holland, never knowing the legacy of his work. He recorded 34 tulip species. By the 1630s, there were 1,600 species of tulips that were cataloged, of which 500 were Dutch. The Netherlands tulips were bred into basically 4 colors: yellow, red, pink, and white. And there were variations that were seen. Variations created excitement. No one knew for sure how the variation occurred. As it turned out, it was the result of a virus spread by aphids, but people hoping to sort of encourage that sort of variation in their tulips would put their bulbs into a bowl of aphids, and the aphids would feast on the tulips, not quite giving the tulip owner the desired results. Rembrandt did not paint tulips. He painted aficionados of tulips. And one of those aficionados was Dr. Klaas Peters. He changed his name to Tulp, and he had a lovely wooden sign carved with his name and tulips on it that hung outside his medical office. And he commissioned this painting that we've seen just a few minutes ago, Rembrandt's Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. For a while, it hung in the Waag that we saw earlier. Now, in 1630, a tradesman in Amsterdam earned about 300 guilders a year. But in 1636, a weaver earned 60,000 guilders in a 4-month period by trading in his tulips. Word spread that there were quick fortunes to be made in tulips, and the tulip trade exploded. Tradesmen sold their tools to become florists. Now, breeding tulips is slow work. A mother bulb might give you 1 or 2 bulbs, and it would take 3 or 4 years to develop a dozen bulbs in your garden. If you tried to proliferate tulips from seeds, seeds don't produce flowering bulbs for several years. So it's slow, painstaking work to proliferate bulbs. But the slow growth in the tulip inventory just fueled demand. And there were auctions several times a year of bulbs being auctioned time after time for increasing prices. Now keep in mind, the Dutch government never sanctioned tulip sales at auctions. Sales were usually occurred in taverns after consumption of great quantities of beer. And tradesmen who had no business gambling were willing to gamble it all to lose their tools for the price of a tulip. Now, there wouldn't have been so many devastating occurrences, so many homes ruined by this tulip mania, if it were not for the instigation of leveraged purchases. There were private loans made against personal collateral. And then sellers devised the sales of futures the future of the offshoots that a bulb might produce, with promissory notes securing the debt, and the offshoot would be sold and resold before it ever broke the ground. Investments were a gamble at their best. It's often said of the Dutch that despite their Calvinist culture of moralism and restraint in personal life, they like to gamble. In 1633, a house was sold for 3 tulip bulbs. In 1636, prices doubled in a week, and the climax came in February 1637, when a single bulb sold in a tavern at auction went for 5,200 guilders. Keep in mind that the most Rembrandt ever received for a painting was 2,400 guilders. And within a week of the February 5 auction, there were no more buyers in the taverns. Word spread of the lack of buyers, and sellers went into a panic. They were left holding futures or pieces of syndicates in a single bulb. They had nothing of intrinsic value. Buyers began to default on loans, and all the creative purchasing collapsed. The defaults in debt radiated down the paper trail. Now, the holders of actual bulbs had sacks of yellow or red bulbs, but they were of minimal value. And the holders of paper on the highly priced bulbs had nothing at all. Now, in 1637, in the Netherlands, debtors went to prison. And as I told you a bit ago, the Dutch government never sanctioned the bulb auctions. Futures trading was actually illegal. But of course, these occurred in taverns, and the prices were put up on a chalkboard that could be erased. Well, the Dutch florists looked to their local government to bail them out, even though governments had never sanctioned bulb transactions. And the local governments looked to the governor in The Hague. And The Hague passed the problem back to the cities to hold their gamblers accountable. People were bankrupt. Tulips fell from favor as gifts, and Dr. Tulip took down the sign outside his office. In the end, everyone looked to the courts for resolution, and the courts asked for evidence. But of course, the evidence in the taverns was on chalkboards, which had been erased, so there was no tangible evidence. In the end, the case is privately settled in the most instances for about 10% of the value. And there began a new, smaller tulip industry in Amsterdam, restrained, eventually highly successful as it grew. And by the 18th century, there were maybe a dozen tulip growers dominating the trade. And what you're looking at in these pictures in the upper left are the tulip sheds along the canals in Amsterdam, where tulip bulbs began to be traded once again from the 18th century forward. In the upper right-hand corner, you're looking at other bulbs. So the caveat is, the warning is, that before you buy any bulbs to take home, you check the packaging and make sure that it's going to be legal in your home state. Well, Amsterdam was the dominant province. Holland and the Netherlands again rose in international commerce, this time with a more restrained tulip trade. So let's look at chocolate. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors observed Aztecs in the New World drinking this foamy liquid made from ground herbs, where they took this bulbous plant and mashed it to a pulp. It didn't occur to the Spanish that what they were looking at was something that would eventually have more value per ounce than the gold that they were looking for. By the 18th century, the Dutch were in control of the trade of cocoa beans. And spice merchant Korff produced chocolate in Amsterdam in 1811. He turned out something called Swiss chocolate, until about 1871. It wasn't the delectable chocolate that we enjoy today. It was rather greasy with cocoa butter. But another producer of chocolate in Amsterdam came up with another idea. He had a two-step process, and he began squeezing the extra fat out of the pulp. This was Conrad van Houten. In 1815, he created what we now know as Dutch chocolate. In his two-step process, the cocoa was heated and pressed, removing a good bit of the fat. And then he roasted what he had to enhance the flavor and enrich the color, the deep brown that we know as Dutch chocolate. In the Van Houten process, the cocoa powder was tastier and easier to dissolve in milk or water. And so Van Houten was able to produce what we know as the chocolate bar. In 1850, Van Houten was exporting his chocolate to England, France, and Germany. And today, of course, from Amsterdam, the chocolate is sent around the world. And they love to spread it on waffles, which you can also buy as you wander the streets in Amsterdam. Look also at the favorite little tourist item, the Dutch shoes. We don't see these around the mills today, and they're more of a historic piece, but they're somewhat iconic of the city. So we look at the clogs of Amsterdam farmers. And I'm switching gears on you once again as we look at diamonds. Religious toleration has long been a characteristic of the Dutch. In Amsterdam, they allowed for religious diversity, and it added to the commercial wealth of the city. Religious diversity meant that Catholics and Jews could pray as long as they prayed at home and not in those grandiose churches designed by Kaiser that I showed you earlier with the spires. Instead, Catholics and Jews in Amsterdam prayed in secret spaces, in the little tiny hidden attic rooms in the houses. During the Second World War, these little rooms were used for Dutch Jews hiding during Nazi occupation. The Dutch benefit to their religious toleration was economic, because when the merchant class of Jews was forced from Portugal in 1492, in the Inquisition of Spain and Portugal, a number of Jews from Portugal came to Amsterdam, and they brought with them their skills in diamond cutting. Now, diamond cutting was previously unknown to the Dutch. Tradesmen in the Amsterdam joined guilds, but Jews were prohibited from joining Dutch guilds. But because there were no Dutch diamond cutters, the Portuguese Jews established their own guilds, which they, of course, could join. And the diamond cutting business in Amsterdam was spreading. It was known throughout the world that the best cut diamonds came from Amsterdam. It was the diamond capital of the world by the 17th century. And the Dutch have led the market ever since. Diamonds don't come from Holland, but that's where the beautiful cut diamonds are found. Well, switching gears once again, I'm going to take you to a sad chapter in the history of the city. During the Second World War and the German occupation of Amsterdam, the Jews went into hiding. Anne Frank, born in 1929 in Frankfurt, left Frankfurt with her family at age 4 and came to Amsterdam. And they lived in this apartment building that you're seeing in the left. Anne and her sister Margot went to Montessori schools, and their father Otto had a job at the Opetka works, This is where they produced pectin for use in fruit jams and jellies. In 1940, Hitler invaded the Netherlands, and Jews were transferred out of the city. The girls were initially transferred to a Jewish school. Jews were not allowed to own businesses, so Otto transferred his business to Jean Guise. Here you see him in a picture with his wife, Miep. This is actually a photo from 1980. And the Mieps of John Guise and his wife, Miep, facilitated the Frank family to go behind this bookcase into one of those private prayer spaces in the top of the building and go into hiding on July 6, 1942. They went behind the bookcase. The Guise risked everything to give them food and to keep their secret. They were joined by a family of 3 in which Peter, then age 16, figured into Anne Frank's diary that she kept every day of her life while she was in hiding. It contains her feelings, her thoughts of growing up, her thoughts of hiding. She'd look outside at the trees because they were a touchstone for normalcy that she knew outside her confined spaces. And on August 4, 1944, stormtroopers disclosed the Franks in their hiding place and took them to a concentration camp. Anne and her sister perished in Bergen-Belsen. Their father, Otto, survived, came back to the city, came back to Amsterdam, and the Guise had found and saved Anne's diary. There were 30,000 Jews in Amsterdam who were kept in hiding during the war and survived. That diary is now in the museum, and what you're looking at is the outside of the Opekta Works, which is now the Anne Frank House Museum, which you'll visit when you come to this lovely city. During the war, to survive, people lived on their tulips. Tulips, chocolate, and diamonds, and the story of the people who lived in Amsterdam. All of those stories are on the streets of the city that you will encounter as you go through Amsterdam today. You'll visit the tulips along the canals. The Dutch chocolatiers still lead the world in making rich, dark brown chocolate, and they've raised chocolate making to an art form. You'll love lingering along the canals as you go from street to street, separated then by canals in the city. And then you'll come back toward the pier and you'll see the modern city and the Science Museum so visible right from the docks. You can go up the stairs and into the museum, an ultra-modern 21st century Amsterdam, a sign that the city, though 8 centuries along the canals, continues to be vibrant and continues to evolve. There's the train station, the brick historic building, because Amsterdam glorifies in the new and in the historic. We enjoy all of these aspects of Amsterdam. One of the reasons that it's our favorite port city that we can return to on cruise after cruise as you enjoy all of the stories revealed. So many ports, so many stories. I enjoy sharing them all with you. And until we meet again in a video or on a ship, travel often and stay well.